Here's the scene that we're going to use in looking at how we simplify details when we draw. It's in the quite exquisite Belgian town of Ghent. Now, in fact, every single drawing we do is a simplification, because even if we wanted to, we could never draw all the detail that we see in front of us or in a photo. So the question is really not so much how to simplify the details, but what's an effective way of simplifying the details? How do we choose what details to simplify? How do we keep the elements of the scene that are essential to create the effect that we want in our drawing, but to reduce the visual content that's before us and transform it into line so that someone looking at our drawing can still read the scene, can still get a sense of what it is, what the objects are, what's happening, the relationship that the various parts have with each other. How far can we go in this simplification? I thought the best way to explore this was to draw this scene 3 times, and each drawing I've done in half the time of the drawing before. And because I'm drawing pretty much at the same rate in each drawing, the only way I can reduce the time is to reduce what I draw. In other words, to make simplification in representing the scene in my line work compared to the previous drawing or compared to the reference in my first drawing, and yet still have a viable drawing at the end. So my first drawing took me 35 minutes, the second one 17 minutes, and the third one 9 minutes. And I started with the longer drawing because it seemed to me that the greater challenge would be to draw this scene in its simplest form. And I thought by drawing the others first, I would get practice at simplifying what was in this scene. And it also would give me the advantage with each shorter timed drawing that I've already observed the reference carefully, and I've already identified what I think are the significant things to create marks for, and so therefore I can really just concentrate on those and reducing those rather than looking at the whole scene from the start each time. So let's create our first drawing of this scene. Apologies that yet again I managed to start this without turning the camera on, but fortunately I'd only just drawn that closest figure and started to position the building on the right, and I realized what I'd done, so it's not too big a disaster. But I felt that this was the natural starting point, this figure first, because then I would scale the building and the size of it and the windows and everything from that, and then I could reference the wall behind off this figure. Then I could position the more central figure a bit further back, and that would let me then position the tree and the building behind, and then that would give me more than enough to easily position everything else in the scene that we had. So I'm spending a fair bit of time doing hatching actually in terms of line work. So this is the 35-minute drawing. So I wasn't feeling too much pressure. I felt like I had time to make all the marks that I was feeling would help represent the drawing, the actual scene in front of me. And I'm really just looking to get a sense of what the tonal values are in the reference. So I want the parts of my drawing that have darker tonal values in the reference to have that same level of darkness, because that's a really important way of distinguishing not just various parts of the drawing, but also their relationship to each other and a sense of depth very often as well. So trying to reflect what we see in our scene, in our reference, is important. So it's happening pretty quickly now, not quite this quickly, but I did feel it was a fairly straightforward scene, just the way the different elements came together. Once I'd got that very first part done, I feel like one part led to another in a fairly straightforward way. I'm just changing my pen to a 0.2 at this point by the look of it, and doing some of the hatching, adding some details. details that I won't have time to do in the next drawing. And I've switched to a 0.1 now, just for this very furthest building at the far end of the street. And now I've switched back to a heavier pen to do some details in the foreground. I want to suggest that this is a cobblestone path and that it's coming towards us. It's not just suggesting what it's made of, but it's suggesting angle and distance as well in our marks. And also giving us something to look at in the foreground. So here now we have our drawing and the reference. Firstly is what simplification doesn't mean. It doesn't mean we don't still work as hard as we've got time to get our perspective angles correct. In fact, because there's going to be less detail in our drawing, it's even more important that the angles of perspective are correct, because there'll be less to disguise them if they're not. Particularly these extreme angles here, we want to try and get them as extreme as they are, and then get this fan-in pattern correct as well, so that we come down to eye level, and it's pretty much at the eye level of our people, because the ground is flat and ours at the same level as them. But we don't find eye level by looking at people's faces. We find it by looking at the lines. And this wall here, we can clearly see the brick lines fanning upwards and downwards. And here we have a straight line that runs across all our buildings. So we need to maintain all of these perspective rules, and not just the angles, but also the foreshortening. We want to get our proportions correct in relation to all the elements in our drawing. So we want, for instance, this building to look this size in relation to this building, in relation to this tree. Ideally, we want this to line up with this building the way it does in our reference, so that we get the same sense of scale here that we have here. That we don't have buildings here that look too narrow or too large for their relative relationship in the reference. And with the figures, it's also important that we maintain the right relationship and scale between them and with whatever they are standing next to, so that we have a sense that all these people sit comfortably in our scene, and that some of them aren't really giants or very, very small, because they don't seem to go with the things around them. So simplifying doesn't mean being a bit less precise with perspective, foreshortening, proportions and scale. Those things have to be consistently correct, regardless of the time we take, regardless of how gestural our drawing is, regardless of how much detail we do or don't include. Now, when we're also considering what details to capture, there are a few principles that I think really give a lot of guidance. Anything that's silhouetted against the sky or against fairly plain areas of tone is going to be seen more easily, and the brain will pay slightly more attention to it and be using it to interpret the scene. And so we need to be careful with our silhouettes. We need to keep them nice and clean and sharp and conveying the information that we want. The second thing we need to make sure whatever we draw contains is the tonal values that our scene has, because they also are usually an important part of how we perceive size, lighting and depth. Here, the fact that this area down here and this side of this building are the darkest tonal values, we want to, if we can, capture that in our scene, because that gives us information. But we also want to get a sense of the shadows. And I just realized that I actually missed this shadow here in all of my drawings. So that's a shame, because that would have added a little bit of interest to this foreground, I think. I also need to pay attention to edges, and particularly where we have hard edges, straight edges, where we have indistinct, ruffled edges, where we have pattern in a way, but still indefined edges, and particularly edges defined by shadow that stand out more. And when we're drawing quickly, I think it's helpful to really consider line direction even more so than normal, because we want to give with less detail, with less visual information in terms of objects, as many clues as possible as to which direction surfaces are in, what shape they are. By contrasting line direction, it helps to make clear that this is separate to that. These shadow lines go this way, these ones go this way. It reflects the fact that this is a vertical surface, this is a horizontal surface. These hatching lines go every which way to reflect the rounded forms that we have in this tree canopy. While we're simplifying the number of various tonal areas, we're still controlling our line work to show the degree of roundedness in this tree that we don't have here. We don't just go all straight up and down and get a very flat surface. Simplifying details is also about working out which details simply to leave out. And I decided to leave out this fencing here, because while this sort of construction work can make a really interesting addition to a scene, in this case, in my mind, it was detracting from this lovely bend of a walkway alongside a canal and the charming buildings that were next to it. I left in these lines that indicated this banding. It does indicate something of the architecture of Ghent. These sorts of bands are very common, and I wanted to hint at some of the architectural detailing here, because I knew I was going to do virtually none of that further back in the drawing. The other thing I wanted to achieve in choosing to include some details and leaving others out was to handle this in a way that helped create a sense of depth. So I included more details closer to the front, such as down here and here and this figure, than I did in the midfield and in the distance, because the eye naturally picks up more detail from closer things. So whatever level of detail I kept or removed, I made sure I included more detail in these closest objects. And as I went right to the back, it was really a much simpler process of really just almost drawing these things through tonal values and outline and silhouette rather than through detail. So let's now draw our 17-minute version. Here's our second drawing underway. I'm speeding up these last two drawings more because it's not so much the actual drawing process that's so important now, because I do follow the same pattern of drawing. It's actually the comparison and the discussion of how the drawings became simpler in various ways under different constraints, if you like, particularly under the different time I gave myself. So I'm really, as I said, following the same order of drawing these things. And of course, it is easier for me to go quickly because I am now that much more familiar with the reference and with experimenting and doing line work. And there are some things I do exactly the same and some things I do a little bit differently in ways that I think might just work better. So just finishing this building up the back, then there's just those final details and I'm done. Here we have our second drawing, and lined up with our reference and the first drawing, this closest building was actually drawn almost the same way it was here. But because I had already had a dress rehearsal, it was actually a lot quicker to draw the same amount of detail. But you can see I did simplify this bush quite a bit. With this brick wall here, I didn't try and indicate brickwork. And my hatching work for this large tree, I think, is really unfinished. And I suspect I plan to come back to it when I left it at this stage and then completely forgot about that. However, I think we can see here, compared to here, that there is simply a lot less lines and they're more gesturally drawn. I didn't try and make this as dark, although it's still the second darkest area tonally, but it's not as dark as this one because there simply aren't as many lines. I would have laid down twice as many lines here as I did here. I'd already worked out I was going to just do these horizontal banding lines as well. I was trying to draw less detail here and here than I did here. There's suggestion of banding down here on the facade. I deliberately brought the tree out slightly further to remove the need to do these suggestions. When it came to this building at the back, again, I was more confident to look at this and then draw it in a faster way. And I didn't include all of the details, all of these little horizontal lines that are to do with representing some of the decorative elements that we can just make out. Interestingly, having had practice doing this edging of the canal, I was able to do it far faster, far more gesturally, and I think far more accurately compared to the reference than I was here. Aligning this point here across with the feet of our two pedestrians. And so this is an example of where we look and we think we've seen what we need to see, and we haven't seen enough to represent it well. And generally we can see that there are simply less lines. I think the principle is, in some ways, that with greater confidence with our line work, with a greater ability to observe and find the information we need to find in a reference, then the easier it is to simplify things. So we'll go now and watch the fastest 9-minute drawing happen, but in a much faster time than that. And then we'll look at all three. So, third time. It's getting quite straightforward now to make decisions about what to draw and what not to draw, how to use my line work. This bush in the front corner is, well, it's barely a suggestion at all, but I want to save my time and my line work for some of the more central elements of this drawing. But I'm still putting my effort, time, line work into creating a sense of tonal values. I'm paying attention to the silhouettes, to the edges. I'm trying to get the various buildings in the right proportions and scale and positioning with each other, albeit in an even more gestural way than I did with the other two drawings. And before I even feel I've begun, I've ended. So here we have our three drawings, one next to the other. At a glance, I think we can see that the tonal values here really do echo the same pattern as here and as here, but achieved with less lines, because overall less time means less lines being applied, and therefore we have to apply the lines we do draw in a sense with greater accuracy and intent to create an effect. So what I worked on was getting this building done, getting the proportions correct, and having a little more detail still here. Goodness, you can't tell whether this is a bush or whether it's just a fancy signature. This foreground was left more simplified because it was a less important part of our scene, which really is focused here in the center. But I actually think I did a better job of representing the architecture with these marks than with these marks or these marks. If you like, I did warm-up drawings in reverse. I did the long study first, and I finished with the fast gestural drawing. But whichever way we want to go, it does show the fact that doing a quick preparatory sketch or exercise where we at least draw some elements and get a sense of what marks we're going to use to capture the essence of our scene really pays dividends in our final drawing. And just as when I drew this drawing, I was drawing less lines that therefore captured less detail than I drew here, I did the same thing here. And I really just indicated this form here through negative space, through the shadows. And this really does become background now. I think it really sits back almost in a peripheral sense. And we really only glance past this third figure, that our focus, because this dark tonal value here is so much darker than anywhere else, this does focus our attention on the center of the scene. And having a figure here which also always attracts attention increases that impact. But again, you'll see I've still put effort into trying to get the perspective angles correct and the proportions correct. I actually changed my hatching direction for the shadow on this wall. Instead of going vertically, I did it horizontally. And I did that to create a greater sense of visual separation between this wall and this building here, which is made up of vertical lines, with this shaded area, which is actually the side of this building at ground level, as well as making it more separate to the generally vertical hatching of the tree. I've got fewer lines representing the pavers, but the ones I've put here still reflect the perspective angle that we get, and the fact that these closer ones are larger, and there is foreshortening that takes place as we move back in terms of how they look. And in each of these, I did keep a balance between more details closer to the front and heavier lines closer to the front than further back. So what do you think? Do you prefer the first one, the second one, or the third one? Why not let me know in the comments? And if you want to have a go drawing this scene yourself, once or twice or 3 times, then you'll find it on my channel community page and you can print off a copy and draw it then. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. But whatever you draw and however you're drawing it, and in whatever time you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.